he's literally at the wheel of a borrowed Land Rover. He's driving at some speed across the Balmoral estate.
This morning, I am chatting today with royal historian, journalist and author Robert Hardman. Robert's recently published book, Charles III, is being described as a brilliant account of the turbulent period in British history. So tell me, what inspired you to write a book about Charles III?
I wasn't planning to write one, and then obviously we had the sad news of the Queen's death, and suddenly, the royal landscape shifted completely. As a journalist, as a historian, these are really big moments. I mean, if you look at the sort of the royal story is almost like the punctuation of our history. We talk about the Victorian era, the Edwardians, Georgians, whatever. Monarchy does, in many ways, set the sort of parameters of how we look at our own time. So I felt I'm going to write a book, and I have.
In what ways do you believe King Charles's upbringing and experiences have shaped his perspective on the monarchy?
He's a really interesting subject as a royal biographer, because he's the first one in a long time who was born to be king. There was a lot of pressure. He was a very sort of groundbreaking, or he remains a very groundbreaking monarch, because it was a different upbringing to all his predecessors. He's the first monarch who's actually been to a normal school, relatively normal. I mean, obviously public school, but been to school, who's had to pass his own exams. He hasn't had preferential treatment all the way through. Of course, he's had immense privilege and all the rest that goes with being the heir to the throne. But I mean, he had to, his A-levels were his own. His Cambridge entry exam was his own. He didn't progress immediately up through the ranks of the Navy, because he struggled to pass the one of the navigation exams you have to pass. So he's, if you can put it like this, the sort of the most normal monarch, the monarch who sort of, as it were, had the most familiar life experiences to his subjects. It's a very odd upbringing, but on the other hand, it's less odd than that of his predecessors.
Were there any challenges you faced while writing the biography, especially sort of given that sensitivity of it all?
I was lucky the king himself, he didn't give me an interview. I've interviewed him a number of times before, but I'd always found him very guarded on anything to do with his own plans and thoughts about what he would do as monarch. Precisely, I think, because he felt that was inappropriate, that was disrespectful to his mother while she was alive, and it would effectively undermine her position as queen. And I think history will look back at her reign and the fact that her authority was completely undiminished right to the very end. She was E2R, she was in charge. No one was saying that it's time to sort of step aside or make way for her son.
And what aspects of King Charles's life and reign do you find most fascinating or compelling?
I mean, I found it very moving, actually, just the moment he discovers he's king. He's literally at the wheel of a borrowed Land Rover. He's driving at some speed across the Balmoral estate from Burke Hall to get back to the castle, because the Queen has suddenly really taken a turn for the worse. And the phone rings. Well, not his phone, but one of the party in the back of the car can see that this is the palace switchboard trying to get hold of him, and answers it and passes the phone to his private secretary, who says, "Sir, I think you're going to have to pull over." And that's the point he learns he's king. I mean, that's an extraordinary moment. We all know, history records that Elizabeth II became monarch while she was in the branches of a giant fig tree in Aberdare National Park in Kenya. And Charles III became king, or learned he'd become king, while he was, driving through the Highlands. The Highlands he's always loved. So it was sort of appropriate, I think, that it should happen there. But I mean, still that incredibly powerful moment. And yet it's it's sort of humdrum. He's at the wheel of a car, and it's sort of, well, okay, I'll be with you in a minute. You know, it's put a car in gear and carry on driving.
So moving on to Spare, I just wanted to ask you about this. I don't know whether you've read it. Have you read it?
It's an extraordinary book. It's probably the most revealing, the most candid royal memoir I can recall reading. It was shocking that a member of the family could just chuck in so many intimate conversations with family members, a lot of which, well, as I say in my own book, I don't think any of the royal family emerge in a particularly grim light. It's a trust thing. People say, well, why can't the family just sort of extend a hand of friendship or whatever? I mean, I think there's a genuine concern now, as there has been for some time, that, well, is there another book coming? If you have a chat, is it gonna end up in print? And I think until people feel that's not going to happen, it's quite hard.
And in what ways do you hope the book will contribute to our understanding of Charles III and his place in history?
Well, I hope it will convey the way that this reign just got off to a very solid and prompt start. We obviously we've got very little to compare it with in my case. I mean, I wasn't born when the last time the throne changed hands. You've got to be well over 70 to remember the last time. But I think looking as far as I can, looking at the files, and as I said, I mean, the King gave me access to the Royal Archives to look at the files on 1952-53, the accession of Elizabeth II. And it was a much more leisurely process. I mean, that was in part because of it was just a different sort of society then, but it was also it was a real shock. I mean, Elizabeth II was a 25-year-old mother of two when she became monarch. Charles III is the oldest new monarch in our history, and he's well into his 70s. I mean, previously it was William IV was the last, as it were, elderly newcomer to the throne, and he was in his early 60s. So there's an element of urgency there, but I hope the book conveys the way that this reign began, at pace. He's the first monarch who can't rely on a nation just assuming and accepting the monarchy. It's got to justify itself. It's got to stay relevant. He and the family have to constantly sort of remind a generally supportive but nonetheless sort of skeptical society of why they're there, and that's something that he has to do, and that doesn't give you any room to sort of it doesn't give you much of a honeymoon period, put it that way. It was a very short honeymoon period, whereas I mean with Elizabeth II, I think the first time her subjects heard her voice as monarch was over 10 months after she came to the throne, whereas with Charles III it was within 24 hours. Yeah, it is, as it says on the cover, it's the inside story of how our king became king.
Brilliant. Well, I've looked through as much of it as I could before we spoke, but I'm looking forward to reading it properly over the next week or two. Thank you so much, Robert.
Thank you, Panda.
Very kind.